Hello everyone, it's Mostrino here, and as I mentioned in the last video, and as you can see by the title, today we're going to be talking about mashup techniques. Now, just like in the transition techniques video, the first thing that I kind of want to get out of the way and make as a point right from the very beginning is going to be the importance of track selection, because a lot of these tips are hopefully going to improve the quality of the mashups, but also the track selection, the tracks that you're choosing in the first place, that's going to definitely have an impact on how these mashups end up sounding as well. So, maybe you want to choose tracks that have maybe a similar flow or a similar energy level, right? Ones that can really blend together will make it a lot easier to get these mashups to work. So I just kind of wanted to give a reminder of the importance of track selection, since most of these tips kind of focus on the technical stuff and not really on the track selection side. So just kind of getting that out there on that's very important, because if your tracks have a similar flow or you edit them to have a similar flow, usually it'll really help your mashup sound much smoother. Now, the first thing that I wanted to talk about are different kinds of mashups, because I'm going to use some vocabulary here and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So for this first example, of course, we're going to be bringing out Ascend again, and the track that I've chosen to mash with it is Medusa by Pixel Terror, Esper, and Isaiah Brown. And again, thinking about track selection, these are both in the exact same key and the exact same BPM, so we don't have to worry about any kind of stretching or any of that. And also, thinking about the style and the energy level, right? Like, these are both supposed to be kind of like aggressive, bass-heavy tracks, right? So combining the two is going to be a lot easier versus if I did Ascend and maybe another track that's in the same key and BPM, but maybe it's a lot happier or more uplifting. Maybe the combination will be a lot harder to pull off. So the first thing that I want to talk about are different kinds of mashups. So there are three kinds of mashups, and every mashup, if you're mashing multiple tracks, it's going to fall into one of these three categories. The first kind is what I call a stack mashup, where you just have the two tracks playing on top of each other, right? They're stacked on top of each other. The second one is called a cut mashup, where maybe you have this part is this track, this part is this, and you're cutting between the two, right? So they're not playing at the same time, you're kind of alternating between them, and that's why it's called a cut mashup. And there are definitely other names for these as well, but these are the ones that I'm using because those are the ones that I'm used to hearing. And then the third kind of mashup is a mashup that's both. Maybe you're mashing more than two tracks, and maybe you might have two of them are stacked, but they're cutting with the third one, right? Or maybe you have just a two-track mashup, but sometimes it's a stack mashup, sometimes it's a cut mashup, right? So every mashup's going to be one of those three, because either the tracks are playing at the same time, the tracks are not playing at the same time, or some of the tracks are playing at the same time, but not all of them, right? So those are going to be your only combinations. Something like an acapella mashup, that's a stack mashup because you're stacking the instrumental with the acapella. The reason why I wanted to get that out of the way is because the tips for cut mashups are going to be different from the tips for stack mashups. There's some overlap, but there's also some tips that really just apply to cut mashups and some tips that really just apply to stack mashups. So I wanted to get that out of the way so you know which one I'm talking about. So for this Ascend and Medusa, we're going to be talking about cut mashups. We're going to be doing a cut mashup example first, and I'll talk about the tips for specifically cut mashups first, and then afterwards we'll go to stack mashups. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that we line up the tracks properly. This includes stretching, making sure that they're in the right BPM, but if we look at where the kick starts, Medusa's lined up really nicely here. But if you look at Ascend, notice how if I play it here, we don't get the kick. If you look at the waveform, the kick's back here. It comes in a little early, and that's just how the audio file is. So we're going to want to drag that over here, Alt-click, and something that might behoove you to know about, depending on how specific and how refined you want to be with these edits. If you go into these options here and you go into Project General Settings, and then you click on this time-based PPQ, if you turn this up, it'll allow you to zoom in a lot more and get much finer edits on the waveform. So let's say I crank this to max. Now I can zoom in really, really far and see, look, the kick actually, even though before it looked like it was lined up, if we zoom in, we see it's actually not completely in there. We can still drag it a little bit further and then actually get the full kick in there. So, you know, maybe turning up your PPQ might be something that you'd want to do if you really want to make sure things are lined up. Though something I should warn you about is that if you have a big project and you have a lot of effects, turning up the PPQ will increase your CPU usage. So it's not something that you should do if you don't have to do it, but if you think that it'll help, then you know that's definitely an option worth looking into. So now that we've made sure that both of our tracks are lined up, then let's just start cutting between them. And as far as the cuts, I mean, there's not necessarily a real like rule book on how to do your cuts. Just try and do something where it feels, you know, it doesn't feel too abrupt. The flow is kind of able to be maintained. You know, maybe you don't want your cuts to be too short if it throws the listener off. So just kind of feeling it out and getting some feedback is going to be helpful here. And, you know, something that I kind of like to do just to kind of hear, do I think these cuts will work, is I just right click to solo these while it's playing and kind of get an idea of what kind of flow do I think will work out so that I don't have to waste a bunch of time doing some cuts and they don't actually sound that great. So let's say we did something like this. Right? Like maybe we can try something like that. So let's go ahead and do these cuts. Of course, this cut tool, hitting it from C or clicking up here, is going to be our best friend. And let's go ahead and hear how that sounds. So definitely still needs work, but at least we've got the idea down. So once you've lined them up properly, once you've done your cuts, something that's very important for cut mashups, not as much for stack mashups, but for cut mashups, it's really important that the tracks are at equal levels. And by equal levels, I mean equal perceived volume. Because if we give these both their own mixer track, we make this one for Ascend, we make this one for Medusa, and we just look at the meter in here, they're peaking at exactly the same amount, but Medusa sounds louder than Ascend. And that's something that I think is really important to get out of the way right now, is that just because the meter is at the same amount doesn't mean that they actually sound the same. There's a difference between perceived loudness and actual loudness. And what we want is we want the perceived loudness to sound the same. Because it doesn't matter if the actual volume is the same or not if they sound off. And we don't want them to sound off. So we have to kind of play this by ear rather than looking at the decibel amount. Though if you really wanted, we could load up some free plugin like the Julian loudness meter that actually does tell us perceived loudness. So let's say we went ahead and we got a sends drop here. And let's go ahead and see what it says. So we're getting some negative 5.7 LUFS, which is just the units. You don't really have to worry about that. And now let's say we looked at Medusa on the other hand. And let's go ahead and load up one on the Medusa mixer track. And notice how we're getting negative 3.6. That's a pretty significant difference between the, I know this already went away, but you remember the negative 5.7 from before. So even though the meters look like they're saying the same, this one is definitely coming off as louder. But you don't necessarily need a meter to tell you that. I'm sure, hopefully you guys probably could have already heard in the mashup, Medusa sounds a lot louder than Ascend. So let's go ahead and adjust that. Let's go ahead and turn Medusa down until they sound even to us. And that definitely sounds a lot better to me than how it sounded before. But now, the next important thing, beyond making sure that the tracks are at even levels, is making sure that the tracks have even frequency responses. In other words, not just that the track's overall volumes are close enough, but that the volumes of the lows match up, the volumes of the mids match up, and the volumes of the highs match up. Because if you're wearing good headphones, you can hear this, or we can just look up here visually. Look at the low end of Ascend versus Medusa. You'll notice that Ascend's low end is going way higher than Medusa's. So we're going to want to turn that down significantly. Just get an EQ, hear it out, but feel free to use this visualizer at the top just kind of as a reference, just to make sure that what you're doing matches what you're hearing. And that definitely sounds much more even to me than how it was before. And the other thing is that I'm hearing that Medusa has a lot more high end than Ascend. So let's turn up the high end of Ascend a little bit. And just like that, they sound like they fit together a lot more than they did before when the volumes and the frequency responses were inconsistent. Now let's take a look at cleaning up some of these transitions, right? Because this one kind of comes out of nowhere. So let's make it a little bit smoother if we can. And here's where something like maybe a volume automation or maybe a filter automation can really help us out. So let's go ahead and let's just pull up another EQ just so that we can have this one being static and this one being automated. And we can go ahead and make something like this. And let's go ahead and automate the frequency here and have it just kind of, the lows get taken out as we head towards the end here. And then maybe do the opposite with Medusa. And let's go ahead and volume automation as well. Because otherwise these just kind of cut off and we don't really want it to be so jarring. And maybe we want to make this transition a bit quicker. Although we are losing a bit of low end here, so let's try and fix that. And of course, we don't want these automation clips to stick around when Ascend comes back in, because now it's going to be at no volume. So let's go ahead and extend them a little bit and just bring them back to normal. And maybe we want to extend this part a little bit, hear what it sounds. And maybe that makes it sound a little bit nicer. But what I don't like is this little gap here at the end of Medusa. So let's just do a little bit of chopping and slicing to remove that. And maybe we can even get a little bit more creative and do maybe a bit of a glitch here. So maybe we chop this up, set this magnet to a quarter step. And we do something like this. Just to kind of spice things up a little bit. And maybe I don't want that sub to be coming in at the end. So we'll do another automation clip, kind of like this one. Let's play it. How does it sound if I extend this one? Maybe I don't really like how this one sounds, but I do like how this one sounds. So maybe I want to copy it over and be able to use it again. And just kind of slice it around, getting it how I want it. And maybe I also want this one to be a little bit quieter than the previous one, so let's go ahead and make that unique and just turn down the volume. And something else worth noticing is, look at Medusa here versus when I turned the effects on. Notice how even though this EQ's actually cutting frequencies, it suddenly doesn't preserve that like peak that it had before, which can lead to some problems and make it a bit more difficult to kind of master the mix. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to make this one unique, since this one's being affected by the EQ. And then the other instances of Medusa, I'm just going to link to a new mixer track that doesn't have anything on it. And I'll just rename this one, call it maybe Medusa EQ. And now, if you take a look over here, we don't have it having those wanky peaks anymore. And Ascend we can't do too much about because we kind of need that EQ, so we can't just get rid of it. But something we can do to kind of tame the peaks a little bit is maybe we want to throw on something like a wave shaper on it, just to kind of kill anything above 0 dB. And I'll talk more about mastering your mixes in video 7, so I'm not going to delve into it too much right here. And there are a few other things that I want to talk about with cut mashups, and then we'll move into the stack mashup tips. First of all, just a little tip for some FL users. If you've ever got your cut mashups all in one track and you want to slide between these two, notice how if I just click and drag, this is extending Medusa, but if I hold shift while clicking and dragging, it extends Medusa and decreases Ascend, or vice versa. So it always keeps them sliced together. You see what's happening right here? Where they're never overlapping. So that might be useful depending on your workflow for doing these cut mashups. Also, as I mentioned in the transition techniques video, using effects might be helpful. Maybe we want to throw some on here and see what happens. And maybe this one we don't want it to stick around so long. So we go into this exhaust and just use this quick fade out button. Or knob, I should say. And maybe we even want to turn down the length so that it fades out even quicker. Maybe something like this. because without it, and then with, just makes things sound a little bit more cohesive, I think. All right, let's take another listen to this mashup. So there are two things that I'm noticing here. First of all is that we do this little glitch effect in the second Medusa instance. So maybe just to keep things a little bit more consistent, let's do it in the fourth one as well. But maybe we want to glitch the first one this time. So again, let's go back to a quarter step and maybe do some sort of chopping like this. And I'm just hitting Control B to do that duplication. And then now we've got that glitchiness going on for both of them. In this one and the second one. And then in this one we do it in the first pluck. And you know, kind of those little effects like that don't really make a huge difference on the mashup, but they keep things interesting. And sometimes they even form like an actual practical purpose as well. Like for this one we were trying to get rid of this little gap at the end. And we could have just done like a little cut in there. But since we're already cutting things, why not kill two birds with one stone, you know, do a little effect that keeps things neat while also solving a problem that we wanted to solve already. And the last thing that I'm noticing is something that I talked about in the last video, which is the importance of using consistent drums might make this mashup a lot more smooth. So we could use sample drums, or we can try using some of these stem drums like I mentioned in the last video and see how that works out. So I went ahead and ran Medusa through Melody ML. Let's go ahead and see what it gives us. And let's go ahead and line these up. Right off the bat, a very usable kick sample. Same with a snare. So I think these two are pretty good. And let's look at things that we can do to make these a bit more usable. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and make this one unique as sample, or hit U. And then it's going to ask you to save it into a folder. And what making it unique as sample is going to allow you to do is now you're going to just have this sample in here. So if you want to use like these out knobs, which is exactly what I want to use right now, it'll let you. Whereas when I don't make it unique as sample, if I want to use the out knob, it's going to fade out the entire track, and that's not going to be useful at all. So now that we have this here, if we just use this fade out knob, we can isolate the kick very nicely. And as far as the snare goes, I think the biggest thing that I want to do with the snare, let's link it to a mixer track, is notice how the Melody ML took out the sub as well. Well, we're not going to need that sub in the snare, so let's just go ahead and throw on an EQ and just EQ that stuff out. And maybe even a sharper EQ just to get rid of everything below that fundamental, which is right here. And notice how it is definitely peaking. Maybe we want to throw on a wave shaper for good measure. So now we've got our drums, right, that we can use to make consistent drums. And what's really nice about this is, first of all, we don't have to do anything to Medusa, because these are Medusa's drums. So when we're using consistent drums, we don't have to replace Medusa's drums with Medusa's drums, right? Because it's the same stuff, right? We only have to replace a send. So that limits the amount of work we have to do, first of all. And also, we haven't really been touching Medusa much at all. Obviously, we haven't been stretching it, but we also don't have any effects on it or anything. So keeping it kind of in pristine condition, you know, that's kind of nice to have. So let's go ahead and let's throw in these drums only for ascend. And what's nice about the way that we have set up this mashup is that this pattern is just going to repeat. So let's go ahead and select the area, make this selection Control B, and it's going to be the same for both of these parts. So now all that we need to do is just get another track for Ascend so that we can do a little bit of ducking to let the drums come through. This Fruity Balance we're already using, so let's go ahead and grab another one just so we don't have competing automation clips. And let's go ahead and set that up. And then we can go ahead and duplicate that. Although notice how there is a little bit of clicking. And to get rid of the clicking, let's go ahead, right click and click select all similar clips. And what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to move these kicks a little bit further to the right. And if it doesn't let you drag this way, it's because you have the very beginning of the track in the playlist. If I just cut off the very beginning, then it'll let me drag that way. So we go select all similar clips, and then just click Alt and drag. And now that should get rid of all of our clicking. So notice we had clicking with the kicks here before, but that's not there anymore. We don't want this kick from Medusa either. So then let's go ahead and make this automation clip as well. And notice we do get a little bit of clicking there. So let's just do the same trick, right? Alt, drag it to the right. We still get clicking, let's drag it further. And there we go. All of our clicking is gone. And now let's play it. Although, since I duplicated this without really thinking, this snare is not supposed to be here, so let's get rid of that. And now notice the difference, right? Without the consistent drums. And then with the consistent drums. The mashup just sounds so much cleaner. And this is probably, I think, one of the greatest and most underappreciated strengths of something like Melody ML or all of these other stem separation tools is for the sake of consistent drums. Because notice, I didn't have to go scouring through all of my samples and my sample packs to find some drums that could fit. And I also didn't need to do anything to Medusa. And there you go. I think that's everything that I wanted to talk about in terms of a cut mashup. And again, feel free to rewind the video when I was just doing those initial cuts before we did any of the edits and look at the difference between that and what we have here, right? So again, just kind of a recap. Of course, lining up the tracks properly is super important, but making sure that they're at even volume and at even frequency response. Turning up the high end and turning down the low end on Ascend was huge in making this mashup work. And of course, effects and using consistent drums. All of these things are going to make a big difference in terms of the mashups. And also, in this specific case, we used a little bit of filter automation on Ascend just to kind of get these transitions a little bit smoother. But that's just going to kind of be from case to case. But I think in almost all cases, making sure everything's at even volume and even frequency response and making sure the drums work well together is always going to be in your best favor. So now that we're done talking about cut mashups, let's go ahead and talk about stack mashups. So here we have a new project file just to kind of show off these stack mashups. And let's do some different tracks, right? We've done a lot of examples with Ascend here. Let's do a stack mashup with something else. So I'm going to drag in Wake Up You're Dreaming by Note Taker, which is in 104 BPM and an F sharp minor. And the track that I'm going to mash it with is Dreaming by Conroe. I know the similarity in the titles and all that, but again, reason why I chose Dreaming It's in the same key, though it's not in the same BPM. Dreaming is in 105, whereas Wake Up Your Dreaming is in 104. And which one should we do it to? Should we set it to Dreaming by Conroe, or should we set it to Wake Up Your Dreaming? Should we do 105 or 104? Well, here's the first thing with stack mashups. These tracks are going to be playing on top of each other. And if you remember from the transition techniques video, especially with the low ends that are really sensitive, you're not going to want to have two low ends playing at the same time. So one of these low ends is going to go. And what you're going to want to do is, whichever track you're using the low end of, you're going to want to not stretch that track. So if I want to use the low end of Dreaming and have it at 105,
it's right, don't die. I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping.
Then I don't want to stretch Dreaming. If I want to use the low end of Wake Up Your Dreaming, then I don't want to stretch Wake Up Your Dreaming, and I want to have it at 104. Is it arbitrary? In some cases, it's arbitrary, but in this case, the main reason why I did it was just because if we look at Dreaming,
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth.
it kind of has these moments where all of the instrumentals are pumping in, and some moments where kind of the bass and some of the other stuff cuts out.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping.
Whereas Wake Up Your Dreaming has the synths kind of hitting throughout the entirety. So I just kind of reasoned that I'd rather have low end in places that don't really need it than not have low end in places that do need it. Which is why I chose Wake Up Your Dreaming as the one to have low end, because it's going to have that low end playing all the way through, whereas Dreaming does not. But since I'm using Wake Up Your Dreaming's low end, I'm going to leave it unstretched, and I'm going to go into Dreaming by Conroe, and let's use the Stretch Pro and type in its BPM of 105. And let's go ahead and put these on top of each other, line them up. And as you can see, Wake Up Your Dreaming, notice that its kick comes in a little bit late. So we're going to want to fix that. And maybe you want to turn up your PPQ to get it really precise. I'm not going to worry about that right now. So, again, what was the first thing that I was saying? We don't want the low end of Dreaming. So let's go ahead. Let's link these to some mixer tracks. We'll do Wake Up Your Dreaming. And let's go ahead and run the EQ and just take out the low end.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm flying for no reason. I've been dreaming.
That way we instantly eliminate any potential problems with the low end. Then the second thing that's going to make your stack mashup sound a lot cleaner is if you're using Sidechain. You could sidechain it to your own drums if you'd like, or you can sidechain the one without low end, in this case Dreaming, to the one with low end, in this case Wake Up Your Dreaming. And the reason why this is a good idea is, first of all, the drums in Dreaming don't have any thump anymore, because we took out all their low end, so they're not really going to hit. Then, since we still have Wake Up Your Dreaming's drums super clean, we haven't touched them or anything, and we haven't stretched them or anything, then if we sidechain Dreaming to Wake Up Your Dreaming, then those drums are going to be able to pop out a lot more, and having some strong, clean drums is really going to help out the quality of your mashups. So let's go ahead and just make some automation clips on Dreaming, load in a Fruity Balance, and do a little bit of the sidechain that way. But notice we are getting some clicking. So again, just like before, let's zoom in. We'll hold Alt. It doesn't let us drag to the right because we've got the beginning of the track in the playlist. So let's just go ahead. I'll cut a little bit of that off. Honestly, I might just cut all of this off since I'm only focusing on the drop for right now. And then let's click and drag until we don't get clicking anymore. Right, and then just like that, all of our clicking goes away. If we put these together, it's a lot cleaner than without the sidechain. And if you wanted to sidechain Wake Up Your Dreaming too and just kind of use your own samples, that's perfectly valid as well. Something else in the kind of the list of don'ts, right? Like don't have two low ends at the same time, don't have two drums playing at the same time, most of the time at least. Another don't that doesn't really apply to this specific mashup, but I need to mention it at some point, is you're probably not going to want to have two vocals playing at the same time. If you think about, you know, your tracks that you listen to, usually the only time where you hear multiple vocals playing at the same time is if maybe it's some sort of harmony. Maybe it's just some oohs and ahs, or maybe they're singing the same lyrics just at the same time, right? But it's very rare for you, especially in Monstercat tracks, it's very rare to hear two different vocals with two different lyrics playing on top of each other, just because it's very difficult for your brain to follow both of those lyrics at the same time, and it can throw you off very easily. So you're not going to want to do that with your mashups. You know, if you have two tracks with vocals that are singing different lyrics, you might not want to put those tracks on top of each other because it'll probably throw off the listener. Again, that's not really applicable at all here because Dreaming is the only track here with vocals, but it's something to keep in mind just as a general rule of thumb. Now when we go back to this mashup, it's coming out pretty well, but there's one pretty noticeable problem about this to me, which is if we take one more listen. The vocals in Dreaming kind of get a little bit buried, but there's a solution to this, which goes back to the last video, which again, I hope you guys are able to see why I wanted to push the mashup techniques video forward, because especially with the last video on stem separation, as well as in the previous video with stretching, these things start to make a lot more sense. We want the vocals to be louder, so what if we just isolate the vocals and then we layer them on top of the original? Now, Dreaming is definitely pretty instrumental heavy in the chorus, so this vocal isolation is probably not going to be super high quality.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping.
And unsurprisingly, it isn't. Let's go ahead and line this up. Remember, we need to stretch this because it's in the wrong BPM, so tell them that it's 105. And then let's line this up.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my.
So the vocal quality is not that great, and I definitely wouldn't use these on their own, but we're layering it with the original, so then it'll work out.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm flying for no reason.
And if it's sounding a little bit weird to you, especially over here,
Losing my teeth, maybe I'm flying for no reason.
since these vocals are taken directly from the original, there's going to be some phase cancellation. And basically what that is just when you have two signals that share things that are identical, it can cause some problems when you layer those signals on top of each other. So to avoid that, let's kind of shift this over a little bit so that they're not super perfectly aligned. And then I'm going to use this format shift tool to make them a little bit different. You can shift it up a little bit or down a little bit. Let's try shifting it down a little bit, hear how that sounds.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm flying for no reason. I've been dreaming, what I believe in, I will get this soon, that's more than just
to kind of minimize any artifacts and problems we might have. And the other thing that I'm going to go ahead and do is, since we want this to have no low end and be sidechain as well, I'm going to put it on a mixing track that is linked, that's routed to the Dreaming mixer track.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm flying for no reason. I've been dreaming, what I believe in.
And I'm just going to kind of boost the high end a little bit just because I feel like the Dreaming vocals, especially after the melody ML, is lacking a lot of high end compared to the instrumental.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm flying for no reason. I've been dreaming.
And when we play these together without the vocals,
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping,
And then with the vocals,
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no reason.
and I think the vocals can pop out even more, though adding them definitely helped, and maybe we want to just turn them up as well.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping.
And use a limiter to catch any of those pesky peaks.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no reason. I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no reason.
Maybe we want to smack a limiter on the main dreaming track as well, just again to kind of keep the dynamics in control.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no.
And then again, all together.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no reason.
And the last thing, which this kind of goes back to the tip that I was talking about in the previous video. Let's go ahead, pull up an EQ, and see what frequencies is the vocal most prominent in.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping.
Maybe around 300 to 400.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth.
Definitely around 2.8K.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth. I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping.
And maybe around 1K. And then let's go into Wake Up Your Dreaming. Let's add an EQ. And let's take out frequencies at these spots. So it was 1K and then 2.8K. We do a dip there. And then we kind of take a listen and dial these in. And let's take a listen. So here's without it.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no reason. I've been dreaming,
And then here's with.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no reason. I've been dreaming, what I believe in.
The vocals are able to pop in a bit more. And again, we might want to make this unique so that only the drop has that EQ dip, and everything before it, we kind of just get rid of the effects and leave it as is.
I've been dreaming, maybe I'm sleeping, losing my teeth, maybe I'm dying for no reason. I've been dreaming, what I believe in. Look at this, it's more than just a feeling.
Although I must admit that this stack mashup did kind of turn into more of an acapella mashup, so some of these tips are a lot of repeats from the previous video, but I do think that there's some new and important stuff in here as well, especially, you know, keeping in mind sidechain. I know I did that in the previous video, but for full tracks as well, in the stack mashups, you're going to want to use sidechain. Taking out the low end is really important, and we're able to stretch dreaming without any problems, because stretching really hurts is it really hurts the drums and it really hurts the low end. And since we're getting rid of both of those, then we're not really too concerned about stretching, which is why we're able to do some stretching and stack mashups that is probably a lot less wise in cut mashups, because we're keeping this main fundamental track with the low end unstretched. I think that that's everything that I wanted to talk about in terms of these mashup techniques, which, if you're disappointed from this video, you were hoping that I would get, you know, maybe a lot deeper, maybe into some of the kind of crazier mashups that I, or maybe some of the other people, have done in the mix contest before that are a lot more complex and use some kind of a lot crazier effects. If you were hoping that I was going to get into those and are kind of disappointed that I only kind of talked about some of the more basic things here, well, you're in luck, because the next video is going to be completely dedicated to advanced mashup techniques and to edit techniques. So that next video is where I'm really going to be diving into some of those mind-blowing mix contest moments that really set the finalists apart from the other people who are entering. Because I think all of these videos so far were like, this stuff is really important that you have down just for the sake of not having, you know, flaws in your mix. But I think the next video is what's really going to show you how to kind of go above and beyond and do something that's really impressive and that really blows people away. So I hope that you've been able to stick around this long, especially if you're more familiar with mashups, and probably a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about might have been review. But I think the next video will hopefully be one where we can really get into some advanced stuff. So I think that's about it. Again, if it shows up as unavailable, it's going to be coming out tomorrow. And also, you know, if you have something you want to ask about or some stuff you want to talk about, hop in the Discord, linked in the description. And I think that that is about it. So I will see you guys with the next one. Take care, everyone.